As I mentioned before, these are some of my former coworkers from IMVU who've come to talk about what it's like to have to deal with my legacy code. And there's no more curious thing as an engineer to see that your beautiful code one day becomes legacy code, and then other people have to deal with it. So I'm extremely grateful to the way that these guys have managed to make the company grow and scale since I've been gone. I want to introduce Brett Durrett, James Birchler, and Timothy Fitz, and I'll let you guys take it away. Thank you very much.
Before I get started here, I have a kind of an assumption that everyone in the room has read the Lessons Learned blog. Can I see a show of hands for how many people are familiar with the IMVU story? Okay, that makes the presentation work out well. This will help me speed through some of the earlier history of the company. Kind of as a quick recap, largely through using the lean principles, IMVU was able to discover the features that would eventually lead to the product the customers would pay for. And one thing that was really amazing about this time is that everybody in the company was working on solving this problem. So everybody had the ability, if they thought of a good product feature, to go build it and put it in the product and test it. So you'd be at work one day, and the next time you logged in and checked on how things were going, there'd be a brand new feature on the site. So that was super cool. The other thing is we used a metric to make sure that we were being honest about the business, and that was revenue. And I think a couple of people have started seeing this. We were getting great results. It was clear that we were successful, and now the only thing we wanted to do is figure out how to scale this and just build a massive business out of it. And so the good news is we already knew how to do this. All we had to do is build a few groups that were about the same size and operated sort of the same way as the company did as a smaller unit. And so we kept adding people to the company, and we'd organize them into these groups that would focus on sort of research, turning that research into a product, monetizing that product, and then sort of running the business, which is things like scaling stuff and dealing with operational issues and stuff. It was also key that we held on to a couple of the principles that made us so successful. We shipped fast, and that we made sure we were testing it with customers. And since we were hiring very, very smart people, we wanted to hold on to the fact that everybody in the company was capable of making these product decisions. Okay, so that's what we thought we needed to do. At this point, we've been adding people to the company, and so our burn rate's gone up. But even worse, our revenue has actually dropped. In addition to the revenue drop, we've been doing this for a couple of years, and we had some problems, but they'd been compounding and getting much worse. So we tried lots and lots of experiments in the product, and it was very common to get feedback that the product felt like a bucket of bolts. And I think two big problems kind of led to this. And I think our focus on sort of certain metrics would make us lose sight of the overall customer experience. And so we could get too focused on the lift that we might get from changing one feature and not actually take the time to step back and look at how all of these features integrated well together. The second thing that was, I think, hurting us is we did 2-month development cycles. So we were still very pushing code all the time, but we'd fund these groups for 2 months at a time. And if sometimes product didn't get completed or a feature wasn't done or maybe had a bug at the end of that 2 months, the team that had been working on that was disbanded and moved on to another project. And so you had these areas that had no ownership, and no one had the bandwidth to go back and fix them. So we ended up with a lot of things that really felt like orphaned features. And so this wasn't working. We weren't getting to where we wanted to go, and so we said, we need to regroup and figure out how we're going to do this. So we built 7 sort of customer experience groups. And what these were is they were going to focus on each aspect of the customer experience. And so we know they get something that's complete, and these owners would own that part of the experience forever. So each of these groups would also have their own metric that we'd look at them and see how they were doing. And since none of them was individually responsible for revenue, it was really important that all of these metrics combined together would end up making massive amounts of revenue for us. So we had figured out a way to deal with the orphan feature problem because each business owner would need to make that work for them to drive their success metrics. And we spent a lot of time to reach this process and make sure that it really addressed our problems. But it didn't. This is kind of how revenue went. And now things actually get to the point where they kind of suck. So after a year of trying to figure out how to make this scale, nothing's getting better. And to make things worse, we're burning through a lot of money. So at this point in the company, we are losing over $500,000 per month. So that's bad. And the other thing is morale is dropping. And the morale is dropping for two reasons. One is because a lot of the internal systems that we had not been funding very well were actually becoming a hindrance to people that wanted to get their job done. And the second thing is we added a lot of people that had joined the company for the rocket launch, and we'd been sitting on a launch pad for over a year at this point. So some of the things that went wrong, and I can only do a few slides on this, so I had to pick a few of them. But at a very high level, we didn't have a team that was working together. So we had several teams, and they were actually, in some ways, competing against each other. And a good example is this. If you were to look at a product owner who had a metric for, say, acquisition, it might be in their interest to buy cheap traffic that maybe doesn't monetize very well. And this is good for their metric and their success criteria, but for the company, it's bad. And if you're another product owner and, say, your success criteria is people making virtual good purchases, it's really bad for you. That didn't work out. People were protective of their resources. They weren't willing to share anything with other people because it would typically reflect poorly on them. The other thing is we had divided the company into 7 customer-facing groups, which meant that teams would have 1 to 3 engineers on them. And when you have 1 to 3 engineers and you have such a focus on moving this one metric, you only invest in things that immediately move that metric. So if you have any technical debt or infrastructure needs that or sort of a longer-term payoff, they don't happen. And so we also got a little bit too obsessed with immediate customer feedback, and I'll kind of get into detail what I mean by that a little bit later. Probably one other thing that's worth mentioning is the switch to this process was a dramatic change for the company. It was not something that we sort of iterated into. We spent it was a lot of work went into it, and without sort of testing it along the way. So we ended up going back to the drawing board, and we needed to get everybody working together, and we wanted to make sure that we had solid product direction that was supporting the company objectives. We also had realized that we needed to make some substantially, sort of big changes that would require a lot of investment before we could really get the customer validation. And the good news is we had spent a lot of time learning about our customers and what they wanted, but we couldn't necessarily fix some of the problems in small increments. And this was sort of not a option for us at this point. We're getting close to do or die. So this is a couple of years ago. We're on a fast track to running out of cash. And does anyone remember what else was going on about 2 years ago? Was anyone trying to raise capital? So in hindsight, though, this is kind of probably a blessing for the company because the running out of cash is one thing that makes you focus on one thing, which is cash and revenue. So what did aligning the company mean, and how does this work? So for IMVU, it meant that everybody was well aware of the company goals and had the exact same incentives. So in 2009, we had bonus plans for everybody in the company, and they were tied to hitting profitability and then revenue targets. And it also meant that the way this also works is at the beginning of or actually sort of before the beginning of the year, officers meet and determine sort of what the overall company strategy is going to be for the next year, and also determine the annual operating plan, which talks about revenue and various other things. It's really key that this strategy is not a list of product features. These are areas that we think are opportunities for the company, and we look at this as it's more clear early, but we're going to get learning throughout the year, and so we expect to adapt as we get that learning. Many people in the company provide input through some mechanism, but it's not a type of situation where we get the entire company together and say, what's our strategy for next year? One of the other things that was important is that we had to align accountability with responsibility. And previously, we ended up in a situation where we had little accountability for results. And I think part of that was because people weren't fully empowered in having ownership of their areas. And so when you have a culture where anybody can make any change to the product, if you're a product owner that's supposed to own part of a product, you don't really have ownership of that. And so you could also end up in a situation where someone made a change that you disagreed with, but now you have the obligation to support the debt that may come along with that change. So this system was not set up for people sort of really taking the ownership. And the hard part about this is these are tough changes, and they're unpopular. When you come from a culture where everybody can make any change, this feel like you're losing something. And one of the things that I think really helped with this is the commitment to say, the fact that we are going to give the authority to certain people to make certain types of decisions also means that you will see accountability for the results that they're going to deliver. So in the current process, product owners are responsible for an area of the business. And this means they will decide everything that's going on in their area of the product. And internally, we have some fancy acronyms for how these break down. But really what it is about building a whole product, monetizing, and running the business, which again comes to scaling and back-end stuff typically. We also have a very active VP of product who works with the product owners and ensures that their decisions are consistent with the overall company strategy. And one of the things I talked about was this commitment to accountability. And one of the most effective ways that we do this is we have a weekly meeting, which is a status meeting where the product owners present their core metrics for their business and how they're doing and what's going on. And this is a meeting that anybody in the company can attend when they want. The other thing about this is it's probably the meeting at our company that has actually the best notes that are sent out to all employees once a week. So you can actually see what's going on and see that the person who's making these decisions is delivering. Also important to this was adding project management, one to help support the accountability, and also to help us understand how to adapt when we saw that something about our process is inefficient. And the way we sort of allocate resources at the company is by sort of a percentage, and this is a combination of product and engineering working together. So product overall decides where the bets are going to be as far as allocating resources, as far as how much, and then engineering decides who the actual people will be, and that'll typically be based on things like skills, training needs, knowledge transfer, and we're open to people moving between teams, but in practice, people tend to settle in where they're comfortable. The other thing that was actually really important for this is we made a switch to using Scrum, and James Birchler is here. And by the way, he was absolutely critical in establishing our project management and Scrum processes. So if anybody needs advice on how to do this effectively and adapt, I really suggest you grab James today. So we actually practice somewhat of a variation, and the points that you see up here are sort of things that we pretty much share between the teams, but each team is empowered to change their process at the end of each sprint, and they frequently do. So each team actually does operate a little bit differently. A couple of the keys, though, are we do get representatives from the group to do a pre-planning meeting, and this helps guide what's going to be going on in the next sprint, and that might be anything from a simple feature adjustment to actually changing what projects are being done. And so engineering, QE, and a product owner are typically in that meeting. And then we have a full planning meeting, which is where the entire team who's going to be working on this sits down and they get a full understanding of the goal of the projects and the scope of them. And then engineering determines the duration for the estimates. And the way this works is we get multiple engineers doing this so that whatever engineer gets the task feels like there's been a pretty good assessment as to how long it's going to take. Another very important part of this that we built in is sort of a technical debt feedback loop. And what this means is as we are working and we see things and we say, this is bad, we need to clean this up, we have a lane and we put this work in the next sprint so we don't lose track of it. And we know that it's something that has to move forward and that we have to pay back. So it's not something where it's like we should clean this up later and it's the last time you see it. So this project management and the tracking and sort of the retrospectives and adapting have led us to have extremely accurate schedules. Talking about sort of the obsessing over immediate customer feedback, I want to make sure I explain what this means. So the customer validation is awesome. And when you get into this sort of rapid feedback and iteration loop, it's addictive. It's almost intoxicating. But sometimes it's important to stand back and understand, have you reached a local maximum? And one interesting pattern I've actually seen happen in the way that we've worked before is it's very easy to look at metrics and do sort of the 90% of a feature and get a lift. And sometimes that last 10% that really helps integrate it and polish it and make it a great customer experience, it's way more than the last 10% of the work, and it's not that much of a lift. And so if you're kind of focused on these numbers, it may be more interesting to move over to a new feature. and get the 90%, or do the 90% of the work and get the lift from that. You get enough of these, though, and I think it kind of leads to the bucket of bolts comments that you'll receive. And the other thing that ended up happening at IMVU is it really made big bet projects almost impossible. So if we wanted to do something and we thought it was going to take more than 2 months, it pretty much was dead on arrival. It's going to take too long. We're not getting enough feedback. It's just not the way we work. And as we had grown, we had learned a lot about our customers, and it was a shame because we didn't have the confidence to sort of make this long-term commitment. And when you get focused on the customer feedback, it's also easy to defer things that aren't immediately customer-facing, like infrastructure and refactoring. And so, just to be clear, the trade-offs we made between customer and infrastructure at the beginning of IMVU were absolutely critical to the success of the company. But also critical was our ability to rapidly iterate, and we were starting to lose that. And so one of my very talented engineers came to me and said, we're hiring smart people and they can't make changes to our code. And this was sort of an aha moment. And by aha moment, I mean oh crap moment. So our RM client, which is a significant part of our product, had reached a state where our best engineers could not add simple features. And we took one approach at this, and we started a bug project where we're going to stamp out some of these bugs. And what we'd find is we'd spend 1 week on a bug, we'd fix the bug, and then 2 new bugs would crop up in what we thought were totally unrelated areas of the code. And we went back to this, we did this for a few months, and it just we weren't making any progress. And I think part of the cause of this was sort of the evolution of our IM client, which was really a prototype, and we had iterated on it a lot, and we put new features in it and tried things, but at no point had we stepped back and said, actually, we have a pretty good understanding about what needs to be in this client. Let's make sure we've taken the time to refactor everything and make sure that we're going to be able to effectively work with what our customers actually want. So we needed a way to pay back some of this technical debt and get ongoing investment in our processes. And as I mentioned, part of the Scrum process automatically now has this paying it forward, and we deal with this in a couple of other ways. Some things we'll do, we'll just say, we need to do a project to fix some area of the code that's really bad. Another thing that's been very effective for us is finding areas of the code that are bad, but we're not actually working in them. So it doesn't make that much sense to spend the time investing in it. And at IMVU, we take payments in pretty much any form that you can imagine. If you want to mail us your old pair of tennis shoes, somehow we'll turn them into credits. But we have a lot of payment systems, and a lot of times these were added by cut and paste, get them out there and such. And what we did is we said, these are really bad, and when people work in them, things break. So instead of saying we need to go fix all these, we just added a tax. And this allowed a product owner who said, I want to add a new payment system to do an ROI calculation and say, well, it's not only the work that I have to do, but I have a tax on this, and I'm going to have to pay back 10 engineering days of technical debt to help make these systems better as we move forward. And as an example for our payment systems, they're much better today than they were, say, a year ago. The other thing is technical leads at the company can have requirements to say we have to pay back sort of a debt to as we're doing the work. And it's also important to note that from an engineering perspective, I feel like you have to have a very good balance of this, because ultimately my goal in engineering is to get as many development resources focused on customer-facing issues. And so the desire to have everything nice and neat and refactored is great, but it's about getting this stuff to the customers. And so when it comes to the infrastructure, a key piece of this is our build systems. Has everyone read Timothy's postings on continual deployment? Who? Raise show of hands. Okay, so the people that didn't raise their hands, run out, read this blog posting. It's about pushing 50 times a day at IMVU. It not only covers kind of what we do, but why it's so valuable to our company. And this is absolutely amazing, and it is key to our ability to iterate. And one thing I think that gets lost with a lot of people is the overhead. So at IMVU, we're spending 20% of our engineering resources sort of related to this system. And some people in the room may be going like, I can't believe that's a huge premium. Why would you do that? Everyone in the company agrees that even with this premium, we're still far more productive in getting more stuff out than traditional systems. And one of the things that's about the system is it tends to run really well, and it when things go bad, they go bad really fast. And so the pain levels sort of at the company follow a square wave. And the pain doesn't only affect your ability to iterate as a company, it affects morale, which is kind of interesting because we hire people and they come into the company and they're used to pushing code once every 9 months, maybe once every year. And all of a sudden, they can't push code in under 40 minutes, and they're really unhappy about it. Another thing to note is we try to keep some SLA on what how the build system should be running. And I found that it tends to work better when you have an individual responsible and empowered to make decisions to enforce the SLA than it has as a shared responsibility. And I think of this sometimes as if you've ever shared a living space with 4 or 5 other people and maybe say, like, hey, it's everyone's duty to do the dishes, you may end up with a pile of dishes in the sink because everybody means nobody. So we're a little more effective with having a dedicated person. Again, if you want to learn about this, Timothy is a person to grab and can give you a lot of detail on our systems. So a really great example, I think, of something that was possible based on our new process is our instant messaging client. This reflected lots and lots of customer learning. And we knew customers were confused. So our initial product was a client download, and we had a website. And to have a sort of an experience, you kind of had to use the client and the website. So for example, if you wanted to purchase something, you go to the website and you buy it. But then you need to go back to the client to use it. And it ended up being like, because the client was at a place where it wasn't easy to iterate there, people would largely put new functionality in the website. And so you'd watch these user tests, and people would come in. And also, while you're doing this, you're opening up a new window pretty much every time. So you watch these user tests. They're trying to do the simplest things. They've got 50 windows that are open on their screen because they've been bouncing back and forth. And they look like a deer in the headlights when they're trying to do the simplest part of your product, which was obvious to us, but to them it wasn't. So we knew what we needed to do. We needed to move a lot of this experience into one location to avoid the customer confusion. But we weren't going to be able to do this with a very simple, quick step. The other thing that was important is we knew that we needed to work on the UI, and we didn't have a client that would support our ability to rapidly iterate on UI, which meant that a lot of the work that was going to go into this was in refactoring and getting everything to a state where we could iterate. So a good example of the result for how this worked for us at the end, though, is we were doing a demo one day, and an engineer had put in a new feature with a button up there. And he said, you know, it's funny. A year ago, adding this button in this feature would have taken me a week, and I would have had to have worked with this other engineer who's the only person that knew that area of the code. He's like, I put this in a couple of hours. So now we had the ability to iterate. And one thing I want to mention during this process is we did not ignore our customers during this time. We just didn't expect them to design our product for us. So the results were very positive, though, both from a company standpoint of product and from infrastructure. Another thing I want to kind of talk about, which is kind of change of process, was Hack Week. This is about once a quarter we have a week where anybody in the company can work on whatever they feel is best for the business. And the way this used to work is people would sort of work on something, and at the end of the week they would have to push it out. Sometimes they finished it, sometimes they didn't, and you would sometimes result in an orphan product because the next Hack Week they may start a new one rather than kind of go back to the old one. Again, this didn't work well with the authority and responsibility thing we were trying to drive to get accountability in the company. So we changed it, and we still have a process where anyone can work on anything, but they can only work on one thing at a time. And you basically need to ship it, which means that a product owner has said, I will take full responsibility for this moving forward. Keep working on it, which means you can go from Hack Week to Hack Week, or you kill it and move on. Strip the code out of the code base, don't let it pollute things. One of the things that's very interesting about this change is we have a much higher level of adoption from product owners. So we just did Hack Week a couple of weeks ago, and I think 3 of the projects got fast-tracked to be on the next sprint for completion and adoption. And the other thing that was very interesting is engineers that are participating in Hack Week, about 50% of them will just simply look at the backlog and pull things forward. And to me, this was a really good indicator that the new process, that the engineers believe in the decisions that product owners are making. Because when given the ability to vote with their own time, they choose what product is chosen. I also want to mention a couple of the key values that we kept. We still use customer metrics to validate decisions all the time. Very metrics-driven company. And while we have changed the authority for or who can make certain decisions in the company, we still value the feedback from everybody in the company. We hire smart people. We want to listen to them. Also, to encourage transparency, we make people feel comfortable with failing and sharing those failures so that everybody can learn and improve. We have postmortems all the time. I can't even tell you how many postmortems. It's all the time. And that's okay. And when we look at these postmortems, in almost every case, the failures end up being a result of some system or process, and we can improve it. Sometimes we actually get down to someone just saying, I screwed up. And that's okay. We hire really great people that take pride in their work, and so we know if that's what the end result was, it's an exception. We can move on. So to kind of cut to the chase and sort of let you know how Plan C has been working for us, pretty good. So the black area of the graph represents sort of us working under this new process. It's good. Do we have time? Shameless plug, sorry. Do we have time for questions? 2 questions? Any questions for myself, James, or Timothy?
I was just wondering how you guys manage prioritization.
Yeah, so why don't I let James talk a little bit about, are you talking about, the question is wondering how we manage prioritization?
Yeah, so presumably getting all this data and getting that feedback, and just wondering how you.
Essentially, our product owners manage all the prioritization. They're the central, all the feedback that we get from customers from various ways, talking to customers directly, going through our customer service team, and our community management team, all funnels through the product owner, and the product owner leverages the other people on the team to make the prioritization decisions. It's pretty straightforward.
Any more questions?
Yeah, real quick. Thanks a lot. Great presentation. I mean,
Thank you.
one question I had for you, and if this is covered in a blog post, I'm happy to take a look at it. But I mean, Eric talks a lot about how you guys use continuous deployment, initially at IMVU, and there's been, some of the clients that I work with, there's a constant debate over how to do that, when to do that, and so it looks almost like with Scrum, you've gone to 2 to 3 week sprints, and so how you've sort of managed both the transition, your thoughts on whether or not that's something that happens before or after product market fit, or if I've completely misunderstood you, then please correct me. So,
Is the question whether we've moved to deploying once every 2 to 3 weeks?
are you using continuous deployment for like bug fixes and making bigger releases every 2 to 3 weeks? Like, I guess how does that all work together?
Yeah, so I'm going to let Timothy go ahead and answer the question.
Yeah, great question. This is kind of one of the common misconceptions. I think the blog post didn't cover it well enough. So when I make a code change, that goes out as fast as possible. When we do it on the website, that means within 30 minutes. When we do it on the client, that means within 24 hours. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've released the feature that the code is attached to. The feature rollout is controlled separately. Flickr actually did a blog post on this. They do exactly what we do. They rederived, exactly the same thing. And what that lets you do is you can say, okay, this code is running, in the code base, in the cluster, but it's only on for people that meet this specific set of characteristics. Maybe that's they're marked QA, or they're marked admin, or they're 1 in 1,000 people. It really depends on what type of feature you're talking about. So now product can make the decision, what's the right level of risk versus information reward versus, marketing potentially. We have a new feature that we know that our customers are going to love because, we're a 6-year-old company. We sometimes know the things that actually are going to succeed, and we say, okay, it's worth the risk to not necessarily do a kind of lean customer development on this feature. We're going to do 3 weeks of development on it and then push the button and it's going to go live. And that has its risks, but also being able to do that, being flexible in all of these different directions, allows us to just do features we couldn't have done 4 years ago.
Great, thanks.
We have time for one more question.
Thanks for the scholarships.
Oh! Do you have a question?
Nope.
Oh, okay. That's it. Thank you very much.